In this recording, we are going to be assessing and review the economic definitions and ways of measuring development are unsatisfactory. A much clearer and more useful picture emerges when wider social factors are included. Assess the view of development and underdevelopment. So for the introduction, you write something like, most definitions of development hang on to the same notion that whatever development entails, it is a good change. Good change is usually seen as some kind of economic growth, but development can also be seen on a social level. Economic definitions revolve around GDP, and that this measurement is often regarded as simplistic. The United Nations produces its own Human Development Index figures, which attempt to move beyond the use of GDP. So, the economic definitions of development and a country's economic label has changed throughout history. Industrialization is seen as a key factor and indicator of development, and statistics like GDP are used to see if the population have material similarities. For instance, for most periods of society, sociologists have looked at the economic sphere as the dominant one when it comes to development. Economic definitions include terms such as the First World, the West, the Second World, communist countries, and the Third World, which is the developing world, or the North, which is the industrialized world, and the South, which is the developing world. However, economic definitions ignore social factors such as human rights, healthcare, and life expectancy. The situation is therefore very complicated by the diversity of economic and social progress found in the developing world today. For example, some sociologists have identified 4 broad groups of societies which make up a hierarchical global stratification system: more economically developed countries, newly industrialized countries, less economically developed countries, and the least economically developed countries. Overall, these terms have now come into a more general sociological use. However, they give the impression that batches of countries experience economic and social problems in a homogeneous fashion, and Amartya Sen found that development should be about freedom rather than economic definitions. So, if we look at the economic measurements of development, one is to use the country's gross domestic product, or GDP. Economic growth is dependent on a change from an economy based on farming to factories, which would include import or export of goods. There are a few economic measurements of determining development and underdevelopment, and one of these is using the country's GDP. The GDP is the total of all wages paid out within one country in one year. It measures the economic well-being of a country. GDP is a useful measure as it gives a ballpark figure for development, and it generally sorts the wealthier countries to most to least developed. However, the sole reliance of GDP to measure a country's development progress can be criticised as it does not cover social issues. For example, a rising GDP does not mean that education is improving. Also, GDP reflects Western values and assumes that materialism is good. And also, GDP does not take into account the sustainability of future GDP. For instance, if a forest is cut down one year, it will add to the country's GDP, but reduces the chances the economy can have the same performance in future years. So we're now going to look at GDP nominal per capita. GDP nominal per capita is the GDP per person in a country in a year. You take the GDP of a country and divide it by the population size. Using this method is useful as it considers the population size, which would otherwise mean that bigger countries such as China would have higher GDP. Also, GDP nominal per capita is seen as a measure of standard of living. However, the problem with GDP nominal per capita is that it isn't an average for the population, as rich people in the country will skew the poorest and hide inequalities within the country. Also, it does not account for differences in cost of living. Moreover, you can also use gross national product, GNP, in order to measure economic growth. GNP is the GDP minus any money earned by TNCs that are based in foreign countries but operate in one country. For example, if a developing country has a large Coca-Cola factory built in the country, then their GDP would be quite large because the output of the factory would be quite high, but the profits of the factory would go back to the owners in a developed country. So this means that GNP is a more accurate measure of a developing nation's economy, as it corrects the fact that some countries can produce a lot, but the money does not stay in their country. However, the problem with GNP is that it overlooks the activities of the informal and illegal economy. So overall, there are many problems with all economic measurements of development. There are many distortions caused with the reliance on economic measurements, as they all ignore individual access to basic needs. They vastly underestimate inequality. None of the statistics give a meaning to first or third world countries, and it creates perverse incentives. Therefore, it is essential to look at wider factors that are included, as they give a much clearer and more useful picture of development and underdevelopment. So, in terms of social factors, the social well-being of a country measures aspects such as education, health, human rights, equality, and sustainability. If you choose education, there are two main educational measurements. These are literacy rates and the mean leaving age of school. Literacy is important because the population are literate, then there are more job and education opportunities. If a researcher wanted to investigate the health of a country, there are many different ways to measure health development. One of these is measuring mortality rates of children. Another method would be to measure the ratio of doctor-nurse to patients. However, if this method was used, then there would be debates about the UK health system, as there is a shortage of healthcare staff. Development organisations like Oxfam, CrustiNaid and agencies of the United Nations argue that the measurement of development should focus on social rather than economic indicators of development. For example, many charitable agencies have focused on the concept of basic needs and that the poor need to be lifted out of subsistence poverty. The Human Development Index, or HDI for short, takes into account social factors like life expectancy and mean years of schooling. The HDI categorises human development and scores countries between 0 and 1, with 1 being the best. For example, in 2007, Iceland ranked the highest with 0.968 and the lowest was Sierra Leone with 0.336. The HDI is also accompanied by the Human Development Report, which includes the Gender-Related Development Index and the Gender Empowerment Measure. Overall, the HDI is a useful way to measure development, as it gives a central view of development and accounts for the link between economy and social well-being. However, figures are a social construction, as someone has decided what constitutes as development. Also, the HDI operates like a league table, which makes some countries inferior, and this may create perverse incentives such as targeted healthcare to under 5s. And also, the HDI is an ethnocentric worldview of development. So, another way to measure development is through social factors, and this can be done through using the Gini Coefficient. This is a measurement of the income distribution of a country's residents, and it is based on residents' net income. The Gini Coefficient is useful as it helps to define the gap between the rich and the poor. So in conclusion, definitions and measurements need to focus on the individuals within the country more, and taking the theoretical idea of using quantitative data would mean that development scientists can see cause and effect relationships rather than using qualitative subjective data.